Hi everyone, this is Pierrick from P2design. A few months ago I released a short movie to promote my new rigging course in Blender. This little movie got a lot of attention even though it was created in a very short amount of time. The trick is to be as effective as possible in your choices to make the different shots. In this tutorial we're gonna create a shooting scene all together with animation, rendering, 2D VFX, everything in Blender. Let's pull the trigger. We're gonna use the P2D rig. You can get it for free on P2designacademy.com. It's the same rig used in this shot. I'm using the beta version of Blender 4.2, go to the download section, then go to experimental and download it. Once Blender is launched, as usual we can get rid of everything, and I'd like to add a camera rig, but my camera rig add-on is no longer available. When I go into my preferences where I can find my add-on list, I can see there's a warning sign. And some of the add-ons I generally use are no longer available in the trunk of Blender, but I now need to go to Blender Extensions. It's the new way we want to deal with add-ons inside of Blender. We need to get used to it, but it will make Blender add-on management way easier in the future. You'll find the link in the description. I will search for Camera Rig in the top bar. I can click onto the add-on, click on Get the add-on, and I can drag and drop this blue box directly inside Blender to install the add-on. This is already a neat feature. When I do so, Blender asks me to enable the online access. I am automatically directed to the Preferences system and I can check Allow online access. Once done, I can go back to the website, drag and drop the blue box, and it will automatically install the add-on in Blender. If I now press Shift A, I can go to Camera and add a dolly camera rig. It's my go-to camera setup whenever I'm working on an animated shot. A best practice when working on a shot is to link your character instead of using a copy of it. Go to File, click on Link, browse for your character folder or try to find your character Blender file. Inside the Blender file, we want to link the collection P2D. We should see our rig and character mesh all linked to an empty, but we can't use it that way. To be able to use it, right-click on the P2D collection, go to Library Override, choose Make, Selected and Content. We just exposed the inside of the P2D collection, including the meshes and the rig, that we can use in pose mode. I generally give my characters collection a color that is easier to identify. I will give it a yellow color by right-clicking on it. And I will get rid of the widget collection used by the camera rig by right-clicking on it and choosing Delete Hierarchy. Finally, to have a better looking character to work with, let's go into our shading options, switch to flat and enable textures in the colors. I also like to enable shadows. If I now select my character rig and switch to pose mode, we can see we don't have the custom rig UI. We need to go to File, Link, and in the Blender file, search for text and load the first P2D rig UI.py. Then open the text editor, open the linked file and run the script. We can switch back to the 3D view and now we have our character with all the rig UI. There's a free video explaining how the rig works on P2designacademy.com. This is the most important part of this tutorial. It's the very first pose. Instead of using the timeline, we will open the dope sheet and switch to the action editor. We can see that we already have an action enabled. Our character is in an idle pose, which is quite ideal because most of the options we need are already enabled. First, let's create a copy of this action we are going to work on and call it shooting, for example. From there, we can start posing our character. So you may want to use a reference, or you can try building the pose directly from scratch. First, I hide the bone I don't need. Then in the timeline, don't forget to enable auto recording. I obviously did forget, but I will fix that. Some key features of the pose. We want to spread the leg to have stability. When shooting with a rifle, you're shooting from a profile stance. So don't try to align the rifle with the head, but align the head with the rifle. One option we may want to use under the gun properties is to switch the gun parent to the value 2 that will parent the gun to the torso. This way, when we are repositioning our character, the gun will follow. Try to make your 3D scene as comfortable as possible. I will hide the delay rig because we don't need it at the moment. From there, I can start posing my character. You can maximize the 3D view by pressing Ctrl Space. If you're not using references, try to mimic the pose. And don't forget to pose the shoulders. Most beginners tend to have terrible poses because they don't pose the shoulders. As soon as you raise your arms up to 90 degrees, you need to raise the shoulders. All the animation will be built around this pose, so this pose must be as nice as possible. Go into the details. Properly pose the fingers to wrap around the gun. Since the gun is using the master option, whenever we move the gun, the arms will follow. So it's very easy to quickly pose this character and make this pose as nice as possible. This is a key to a great shot, and this is key to a great animation. Posing is the most important thing. Motion is not as important as posing. So I'm just checking if my character is balanced, if it doesn't feel like it's falling forward or backward. I'm also checking if the pose has a good directionality. Here I have a clear line of action and I do understand in which direction my character is gonna shoot. I can tweak this pose forever. Right now I'm pretty satisfied with it. I just need to spread a bit the legs because I feel like my character is slightly off balance. But let's call it done. Let's set up the camera. I will unhide the camera rig and select it. The cool thing with this camera rig is that we have access to the Passepartout option directly in the item panel. I always use an opacity of 1, because whenever you see what's out of the framing, it will trick your brain. It feels like you're framing way more than what's in the frame. The best way to prevent that is to keep an opacity of 1. For a more cinematic look, we can use a ratio of 21:9, and we'll keep the frame rate at 24 frames per second. With this setup, we can key all the controllers of our camera. In pose mode, I select one of the controllers of the camera, press K and choose whole character. This will automatically create an action and key all the available controllers and custom properties. We can now work on our camera. I like to have a dedicated camera view, so I will create a new 3D editor window, disable all the overlay, make sure that my shading is set to flat and I am using the textures, and now I can work in my 3D view to pose the camera. We can slightly offset the root of the camera, and then we can play with the two main controllers of the camera. One is to move the camera, the other is to move the camera target. And basically, on frame 0, I will create a first camera position. Then I will move to frame 1 and I will create another camera position. And I'm basically experimenting with different shots. I don't have a clear shot in mind. I like to do something different than what I did in the short movie, where it was a pure profile. I like the character to slightly point at the camera or have a 3/4 point of view, something like that. So I play with the camera position and the focal length. The shorter the focal length, the wider will be the framing, and the more distortion you will have. So if you want an anime style kind of framing, use a very short focal length and get the camera very close to the character. Every time I feel like I get an interesting camera framing, I will just move to the next frame and create a new camera pose. The posing and framing is often defined during the boarding stage, when you create the storyboard. But depending on the production you're working on, you may have more or less freedom to change the framing. In this case, it's a personal shot. Nobody's here to tell me what to do. so I can experiment to get the best result possible. And here you can see I have like 5 or 6 different camera positions that I enjoy more or less. And I think I will play with this one. So I will first create a fake user to the current action not to lose it. Then I will duplicate the current camera action and get rid of the camera poses I won't be using. And optionally, you can rename the camera action. I will simply call it camera. This is where we can refine the pose and the framing. To do so, with the camera selected, we can activate one of the composition guides. They can be found in the item panel, and I will enable the thirds. As we do so, 3 dotted lines appeared in the camera view, separating our camera space into thirds. What you generally want is to have one of the point of interest on one of the thirds. In this case, the character's body with the head more or less aligned on one of the thirds. And another important thing is that my character is looking at the most opened side of the camera framing. Once there, I will slightly refine the camera position, but also my character pose. We created a standard shooting pose, trying to make it as balanced as possible. Now I want to make it to look as best as possible from the camera point of view. And this is super important. When animating to the camera, what matters is what we see from the camera view. So I just lowered the gun a little bit and moved the head a little more forward so that we do feel like the character is looking into the scope. I feel like the pose and framing look good, and this is the most important thing. So now we can make it move. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, a nice comment, and subscribing. We all know that animation takes ages to be done, but I got to this result in less than 10 minutes. The trick for this specific shot is to find the pattern. We will only work with the needed controllers. We need both gun controllers and the torso controller. Frame 0 is our first pose, the base pose. We will animate on once, meaning that we will insert a key every one frame. And to get this kind of skipped frame style, we will keep everything in stepped mode or constant interpolation. I've said that we need to find the pattern, basically the different step of the gunshot. The first one is the recoil of the muzzle. So we need to push the muzzle inside the gun. And then on the next frames, we will animate or pose the reaction. On frame 0, we have our original pose. On frame 1, we just pull the muzzle inside and slightly move the body and gun backward. One super important thing is that everything is connected. So when the gun is moving, because of the recoil, it will push the shoulder, that will push the torso, etc. In the action editor, on frame 1, I will press I and key all the channels. Now I can select all the keys, press T and switch to constant. On frame 1, we moved a lot the muzzle and very little the gun. On frame 2, we will now have the full recoil, so we can move the gun backward along its y-axis or along the muzzle as if it was pushed by the shot, basically. And as I said before, since we have a strong recoil in the rifle, we also need to push our character backward a little bit. So we can select the controller of the torso or center of gravity and push the character backward in the same alignment as the gun. Then you can add a bit of variation, a slight rotation in the head, a slight rotation in the chest. Then on frame 4, we will push the body slightly backward as it's finishing its recoil, the reaction with the gun, while the gun is slightly moving forward and the muzzle is getting back in place. Then on frame 4, we will reset everything, our character will get back to its original pose, and on frame 5, we will shoot again. So it's a very, very short kind of cycle. But the thing is, we will do that like 2 or 3 times, and each time we will slightly change the position of the gun, the position of the character, so that it doesn't look like we're repeating the same cycle every 4 frames. So this is our pattern. The muzzle gets inside the gun in 1 frame. almost instantly when we trigger a shot. It slightly pushes the rifle, but then the rifle on the next frame is pushed a lot. The body moves slowly in the beginning, and as the rifle pushes it, it moves faster. And then all the different parts of the body get back into the initial pose progressively and in a slower pace. In our case, it's only 2 frames, but that's the idea. Everything resets in cascade in a way. Then I'm repeating this pattern from frame 5 to frame 9 or 10, but I'm slightly changing the angle of the rifle, the height of the character, the rotation of the head, so that it doesn't look exactly the same as our first cycle. And I will do that 3 times. Slightly changing the initial pose, slightly changing the reaction, but always having the same pattern. Muzzle first, pushing the gun push the body and the rifle gets back in place, and we do it again. Using the same method, I created 6 different cycles. So basically around 30 different frames with 6 shots. Once I have this space, we can click on the push down button in our action editor. This will push the current action into the NLA editor. So we can now open the NLA editor and click on Show Only Selected so that we only see the strip of our character's rig. From there, in the strip menu, under Action Clip, we can repeat several times this cycle. Let's repeat it 2 or 3 times. Once there, we need to slightly refine the animation. So I already did that. I will explain you how I did it. Thanks to the NLA editor, we can see multiple cycles of our animation, which allow us to have a good feeling about it. But maybe we need to tweak some position, like the head rotation or the shoulders. In the NLA editor, with the strip selected, you can press the Tab key to enter Tweak mode, and then open the Action editor. So basically, you're editing the action used by the NLA editor. We are still playing the action in cycles through the NLA, but we can also tweak the action. From there, what I did is that I added some secondary motion in the shoulders, for example. The shoulders get pushed by the gun and then they come back with a slight offset compared to the body. This creates some nice follow-through and it feels a little more organic. Another tip that will save you a lot of time and allows you to really tweak your animation is to switch to the graph editor. Even though we're using stepped interpolation, I will select the center of gravity of my character and only show the location curves. Pressing Alt-D, we can access different blending mode or blend operators, and we can use the scale average operation. By increasing the scale, I will increase the recoil in the body, or I can reduce it. I originally felt it was a little too strong, so I slightly reduced it. And you can see the result live on the right, so that's super powerful. You should try this on both the rifle and the center of gravity. And that's about it for the animation. One of the ingredients of this style of animation or render is to use 2D VFX. We're going to use grease pencil to create our muzzle flashes. I just collapsed the NLA and replaced it by the timeline and reopened the action editor. I snapped the 3D cursor somewhere near the muzzle of our rifle. We can press Shift A and add a grease pencil object and move it so that it's in between the muzzle and the camera. Through the outliner, I will select the grease pencil object, press M to move it into a new collection that I will call VFX. We can also rename the grease pencil object muzzle, for example. In the 3D view, press Ctrl Tab to switch to draw mode. First, I want to enable the merge option. This will help us keeping closed solid shapes. In the tool option, I want to get rid of all the pressure sensitivity. We'll be drawing solid flat shapes. Thickness or transparency variation won't be beneficial for us at all. I advise you to do the same for the eraser by selecting the eraser tool and just disabling pressure sensitivity. In the 3D view, you can switch to camera view, as we're going to draw through the camera view. In the properties editor, I will rename the first layer Guides. We will just draw a few lines that will help us to create our shapes. You can try to draw them by hand, or you can use the line tool. Simply drag and drop to create a line and press enter to confirm. The first line defines the directionality of the gun, and the two other the cone created by the muzzle. We will draw our shapes following those guides. We can draw more lines if we want. We can now rename the material used to draw those lines and call it guide, for example, and give it a brighter color. From there, we can go back to our grease pencil properties or grease pencil layer and create a new layer that we will call muzzle. Then we need to create another material that we will call muzzle 2. The selected material or active material will be the one used whenever you start drawing. We'll be drawing an outline and then we will fill it with a solid color. You can give the solid color a temporary color using a very bright pink, for example, so that you clearly see the silhouette of your drawing. Let's start drawing. First, switch from the action editor to the grease pencil. I will select the guide layer and draw myself additional lines. These will greatly help me designing the muzzle flash shapes. The most important being the directional branch of the muzzle flash. I can now select the draw tool and select my muzzle layer. Go on the first frame where the flash is supposed to happen. Make sure the muzzle material is selected when you're drawing. Basically, we will be doing one frame drawings each time the muzzle gets into the rifle. I will create 5, 6 or 7 different muzzle flash and then we can duplicate them along the way. In the material properties, you should switch on and off the material and stroke just to see how it looks. Because the feeling of a solid shape compared to the feeling of an outline is pretty different. And what we're going to see is the solid shape. But it's easier to draw using a stroke or an outline, as I'm doing right now. By default, a keyframe drawing will be held forever unless you create another drawing or you insert a blank keyframe. Onto frame number 2, press I to insert a keyframe. This way our drawing will flash on the first frame. From there we can move to the next frame where the muzzle is getting inside. It's frame 5 in my case, and I will start designing another muzzle flash. Once I have several different shapes, I will simply duplicate those drawings along the timeline, and then you can press Tab to enter edit mode and slightly offset their position, for example. Or you can slightly redesign them. If you want to do it the hardcore way, you can create a different drawing for each muzzle flash, but in my case, I want a nice result as fast as possible. Each time I create a new drawing on the next frame, I will add an empty keyframe so that the drawing only appears on one frame, and then along the timeline, I will duplicate the different drawings. Once we are done assigning a drawing for each shot, you can edit them by adding some details. You can redraw them a little bit or simply add some sparks, for example. I will go back to my grease pencil layer and I will create a new layer that I will call inner. I will also create a new material that I will also call inner. My goal, you guessed it, is to create inner shapes on the muzzle flashes. I have a couple of advices. Don't draw the inner shape following the outer shape. And don't draw an inner shape for all the muzzle flashes. Variation is the key as usual. If you're struggling with the design, check out my grease pencil dedicated tutorial and study shapes from stylized 2D VFX from your favorite artist or from video games, whatever, but just find reference and just redraw those VFX. It's okay to reproduce someone else's work whenever you're training. Here I'm creating my own shapes, I'm not copying any shapes, but it's not like I'm reinventing the wheels. You probably saw this kind of shape somewhere else. And this is the final result of my grease pencil animation. Let's add a background and some lights. To make the background, I will also use a shortcut. Instead of modeling it myself, I will simply use kit bashing. You can judge by yourself, but this guy known as Rex on the Blender market knows how to create super cool sci-fi assets. And based on our framing, I guess I will only need a couple of folds, so I just need one kit and that's it. Once you got the model, I advise you to organize the different folds or the different kits into collections. This way we can easily link them into our scene. In our main scene, we can switch back to object mode, create a new collection, I will call it background, and then I will go to File, Link, and I will link all the collection from the whole asset pack. From there, I will go to File, Link, and I will link all the collections from the asset pack. From there, I can select a couple of wall models I like, and then simply put them in the background. I slightly rotated them so that they are more or less in the same orientation as the character. This will better support the global perspective and global composition. Again, don't overthink this part or don't try to make it match perfectly. Roughly position the walls, make sure you don't have holes that will show the background. And if the wall is not high enough, just duplicate it and put a copy on top of the other. I also used another copy of the wall to make the ground. All of this will be in the background. We will probably use some depth of field, so it's gonna be blurry, so we don't really care. If you feel like it's not fancy enough, then you can download other kit bashing and add some details. I just added a column so that it kind of breaks the rhythm in the background. When it comes to lighting, even though it's an interior, I like to start with an HDRI. As you may already know, my favorite place to find high quality HDRI is Polyheaven, and you can get those assets for free. So the idea is to find an HDRI that kind of match our environment. So I like to use an industrial interior. I like the cold tones of the peppermint power plant. You will find the link in the description. Back in Blender, through our properties editor, we can pick the render engine we're going to use. We're gonna use Eevee next, which is the default Eevee now in Blender 4.2. Under the engine properties, we want to enable ray tracing, and we can also enable volume shadows under shadows. Basically, we're enabling all the fancy options. I will make some room and press Z to enter rendering mode. Thanks to video editing, it's super fast. I will open the shader editor and I will switch to World. I'm using the Node Wrangler add-on, which is a core Blender add-on, so you just have to enable it. I can select my background node and press Ctrl T, it will automatically create a texture setup. From there, just click on Open on the environment texture and browse for your HDRI. Boom, it already looks way better than what we had. Now just play with the Z rotation of the HDRI until you get nice shadows. I believe in any action shot it's important to have clear shadows, a clear directionality in the lighting. It will help reading the silhouette of your character and the environment. So I'm just playing with the rotation value until I find something I like, basically. And this is the lighting I will start with. You may have noticed that we no longer have the bloom option in Eevee. So let's open the compositor and enable use nodes. If I press N to open the properties panel and go to the options, we can now enable GPU as the rendering device, and it makes viewport compositing so much faster. From there, in the 3D view, under the rendering option, we can enable compositing only through camera view or always, so that it always appears in our 3D view. Now we can go back to our compositor and press Shift A to add a filter glare. This will mimic our bloom. By default it uses streaks, we will switch to fog glow. The lower the threshold value, the more glow we will have. It corresponds to the RGB intensity of a pixel. So any pixel that has a lighting value over 1 will trigger the glow. So let's add a couple of new lights. I will reopen my 3D view. I will create a dedicated collection for lighting. And then in the 3D view, I will press Shift A to add a light area light. Our directional lighting or key lighting is already achieved by the HDRI. I want to create a rim light to make the character pop out a little bit. So I will position the area light in the back of the character and I will rotate it so that it more or less points toward the camera. The great thing is that our HDRI kind of brings a very cool lighting, but we have orangey yellow lights in the background. So I will create a yellowish orangey rim light to create a nice color contrast. We can give this light a pretty warm color, and as a power of 500 is a little too much, I will tone it down to 300. I like how it looks in my rendering. We can now create a second rim light that will light our character from the other direction. We can simply duplicate our existing light, put it in the back of the character. I will reposition and orientate it so that I don't have too much influence on the wall, and I will change its color to a colder color. This is something I do in almost all my rendering, having a very warm rim light and a cold rim light on the other side. It's not super original, but it works for me and I'm not a lighter. So we now have our two rim lights. If you want, you can put them in a dedicated collection. And what we are going to create now is a few lights just to create some kind of indirect lighting from the lights in the background. There are some kind of LEDs on the column, on the wall. So I will just align the lamp and I will try to light a bit the surroundings with the same tone and color. But I will keep it very low. The idea is just to bring some appeal to the scene and more colors. I will create a third rim light on top of my character so that the head of the character pops out a little more. And I will create a last light, some kind of a supportive key light that will light our character from its front so that it stands out a little more compared to the background. I also like the fact that the far background is cold and the foreground is warmer. I do like what I see now, so you can move the different lights in different collections just for the sake of organization. One thing that will really help us creating convincing muzzle flashes is to have light coming from them. To do that, we simply need to place a point lamp in front of the gun. Don't put it right at the end of the muzzle or it will only light the tip of the gun. Just move it a little forward, like 50 centimeters to 1 meter. Give it a bright color, a pretty intense power. I'm using a power of 500. And basically what we are going to do is to animate the power value. So I will press I on the power to insert a keyframe. I will then open my timeline and I will simply key this light every time I see a muzzle. You can select the keys and press T to switch them to constant, use a value of 0 whenever there is no muzzle, and use a value between 0 and 500 whenever you have a muzzle flash. The idea is not to use always the same value again to create visual variation. I'm basically using the drawing of the muzzle flash to say, okay, this is a small muzzle flash, so I will use a lower value. And if it's a big muzzle flash, I will use a pretty high value. And this is how it looks once I keyed all the values. Right now, everything is in focus in our render. What we can do is select the camera object, go on frame 0 where we key the different options and enable depth of field. As we do so, we can see our character is super blurry. He's simply out of focus. In your camera option, enable show limits. And now you can play with the focus distance and you see this yellow cross. This is the focal point of the camera. So I will place it more or less on the gun. And now our character is in focus while the background is slightly blurred, creating a more filmic style. Adding some camera shake will definitely improve our shot. To do so, we'll simply add some noise to our camera's root. Open the action editor, then select the camera and select the camera route. We don't need all those keys, so we can get rid of all the channels but the location channels. Press Ctrl Tab to switch to the graph editor, and in the Properties panel, we can go to Modifiers and add a noise modifier. If I now play the animation, you can see that the camera shake is super strong. So we need to radically reduce the strength. I will try 0.1, and it already feels way better. I will try a value of 0.05, and then I will copy the modifier. Right now only the z-axis is modified. I will select the y location and I will paste the modifier. When you're duplicating a noise modifier, it's important to offset its value. This way the different location channels won't be moving in sync and you will get a more natural noise. Simply repeat the process for the x-axis and we're good. If you feel like there's too much noise, tweak the noise modifier, or you can deactivate one of the channels or deactivate them all if you want. We could do the compositing directly in the 3D viewport, basically adding filters onto our grease pencil object. The glow filter is my go-to. You can choose the color, you can choose the blending mode, and it works like a charm when using sRGB color space. But here we're using Filmic and it feels a little toned down. So we could duplicate some of the layers, switch them to add to make the colors brighter and more powerful. But when mixing 2D and 3D like that, it's very hard to control the colors of the grease pencil object. So what I prefer to do is to do my compositing in After Effects. So I will give easy to identify colors to my grease pencil object and I will render it on a separated layer basically. First I will disable my 2D VFX collection. Under my output properties I will make sure that I'm using PNG. I will switch the color depth to 16 bits and I will create a render folder where I can save my PNG sequences. Once I'm done with that, I will name my PNG and then I will simply press Ctrl F12 to launch the rendering of the animation. Once I'm done rendering the 3D, I will reactivate my 2D FX collection and I will deactivate all the other collection. In the rendering properties under Film, make sure transparency is enabled. This way you'll have a transparent background. Then in the output, just rename your PNG. I will simply call it muzzle underscore and I will press Ctrl F12 to render it. You can definitely do the compositing in Blender, but I prefer to use After Effects. With Ctrl I can load both PNG sequences. By default, After Effects frame rate is set to 30 frames per second. I will press Ctrl Alt G to change the frame rate to 24 frames per second. From there I can right click on the main sequence and create a composition. Then I can drag and drop the muzzle flashes composition and play it. I know my After Effects is in French, but you can reproduce this in any compositing software. On the muzzle flash layer I will use Generate Fill. Basically it allows you to fill the layer with a color. I will use a bright orange. From there I will play with the blend mode, so generally I use regular, add and lighten. Then what I do is that I duplicate the layer 2, 3, 4 times, it depends, and on each of those layers I will use a Gaussian blur with a different factor. One can be low like 30 pixels for example, and then I can crank up these to 200, 300, 500 pixels to create a glow effect. Then I will duplicate the layer again, remove all the effect and isolate the green color, basically removing it using a filter. You should find something by searching for mask by color, basically. And then I will repeat the process for the inner shape. Give it a bright color using the fill filter, duplicate it once or twice and then give it different amount of blur. I won't blur the inner shape that much though. The idea is to keep one of the layers pretty sharp so that we keep our nice 2D shape and this nice 2D style. And in the end, I will duplicate the very first layer, give it a warmer color, a more reddish color, and blur it a lot to create a more nuanced glow in the background. We could have added a slight volume shader in Blender to get more blending in the background, and use a particle system to emit bullet shells whenever it's shooting. But since the gun chamber is on the other side, it's not that big of a deal, but if you want to add more details, that's something I would do. And here is the result with sound. This is the end of this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.